Welcome to our discussion on cultural dynamics. Today, we are going to talk about elements of culture. What defines a culture? Then we're going to get more specifically into some of the really big aspects that define a culture, such as deep structure, worldview. We'll talk about dominant and co-cultures. So within cultures, you will have those that are really pervasive, meaning most of us tend to belong to them. But then there's also these subcultures, these co-cultures that are smaller, have less members, but can still be very significant in our lives. We'll talk about high in context cultures. This is a specific aspect that tends to define a lot of cultures and the big role that social institutions play in all of this. So this is really our chance to understand what culture is and what are the key aspects of it in today's discussion. So elements of a culture. So the definition is basically a group of people with shared socialized meaning and norms. So these people have the same, not just meanings of things, but understandings of things. Oftentimes they have shared experiences, right? And they engaged in shared norms or patterns of behavior. Now, obviously, this is a communication course, so that can include ways of speaking or ways of communicating, but it can also, of course, encompass all kinds of aspects of their lives, everything from their religious practices, right? Political systems, family structure, all of that sort of stuff. So it's just having these short patterns. And when I say socialized, what I mean by that is they're basically things that are taught to us, right? By either society literally telling us that or we observe it in society, but it basically gets institutionalized within us through others. So it's just basically people that have these shared norms, not just like patterns of behaviors, but ways of thinking, I guess would be a good way to think of it. So it really encompasses things outside of it's not just like I think in a lot of sense, when people think of culture, when they hear that word, they think of ethnicity or race or nationality, right? Like citizenship. And those are certainly cultures, but those are really large, dominant cultures. And culture can mean a lot more than that, right? It can really be any group that you belong to, and really just any group that has these shared sort of ways of thinking and ways of acting, right? I guess is the simplest way to think of it. So elements of a culture, oftentimes they will include the following things. So beliefs and behaviors, like I just discussed, similar structures. So they tend to comport to the same sort of group structure, whatever group we're talking about, okay, whatever those norms are. So um, an example would be like some cultures have different sort of shared structures in terms of family unit. So for example, there's some cultures where more family members will live under the same roof, like where it's more tradition where you'll see parents but their children, even though they're over 18 or 21, let's say, still living at home, and the grandparents still live in the same house, right? Like where that is the common structure, and less so in other cultures, right? And so you might see something like that in terms of organizational structure, but similar structure. Communication style, okay? So obviously people tend to get socialized to communicate a certain way. You've probably already experienced this, where maybe obviously it's going to be a big focus in this class about how different cultures will communicate with each other differently. But certainly groups, just think of it if you haven't dealt with a lot of cultures, right? In the traditional sense of like ethnicity and race and things like that. And I'm sitting here telling you that culture is really just about a group, right, with shared beliefs and practices. You have probably already experienced communicating with different groups with shared beliefs and practices, right? Different, think of like identity, right? When you think of somebody's identity, right? You've probably already experienced where haven't you gone out into the world and you've noticed that people with certain identities tend to talk differently, right? They communicate differently. An example would be generations, right? Gen Z, Gen X, boomers, right? Like they all communicate a little bit differently, right? We've seen that. We've seen people who, I'm sure you can think of examples of people who have different aspects of their identity that are really important to them, and they tend to talk a certain way that kind of expresses that identity, right? So you'll see that kind of thing. So that's an example of a group adopting a communication style, right? I mean, when you see people with a certain identity association all talking the same way, that tells you they've all adopted that learned that socialized communication style, right? or different generations, right? And so communication style is certainly a big one. Obviously, it's going to be the focus of this class. And then history. So that's really just kind of dealing with shared experience. And when you have shared experiences, that obviously can bring people closer together, certainly from a standpoint of just like connectivity, connection, but also culture is just shared groups. Obviously, if you're in the same group, you'll have that shared experience. So that tends to be another aspect of it. And then there's something we're going to talk about today, which is called deep structure. And the deep structure is basically the foundational pillars of a culture, the things that are like really rooted in, right, to a culture. And those things really resist change. You know, cultures can adjust and ebb and flow and a lot of other dynamics, but they have a tendency to not resist change when it comes to their deep structure. So those are some common elements of a culture. And again, what culture really is a group of people, shared ways of thinking, shared behaviors. It's usually been socialized, like sort of taught and learned. And if you think of these, this PowerPoint slide here, where you've got these different groups, this is kind of what I wanted you to kind of like think of it is. So you've got obviously race, ethnicity, nationality, kind of like the big tent that we usually think of it in. But you have other things. Religious affiliation is certainly a big one. Maybe less so now than in prior generations in a lot of cultures, but still ever present, right? So, group membership. So remember, I said it's kind of like any group. So this could also include, for example, workplaces, right? You maybe have heard the term company culture, right? Or organizational communication, for example, is a class you could take, right? And they'll talk about this that like you go into a certain job and a job can have a cultural environment, right, that makes you comfortable or not comfortable. Another example that if you don't have a ton of work experience yet would be even in classes, right? Have you ever taken a class and you really like the instructor, you really like the students in the class, and it's just like as a class that you really enjoyed going to, right? Because of that group dynamic and then like just the culture, the environment of the room, right? And so, really, any group that you belong to can have a culture. So, this could be a workplace, could be your family unit, and they vary, right? Like, so take family units, right? We all know situations where some family unit, like that environment, is just healthier, right? And the culture in the group just seems to be healthier in the sense of like leading to positive outcomes for everybody. And then you've got other groups that aren't healthy, just like you have other job environments that aren't healthy, right? So it could be any group that you belong to, whether it's your work, your family. It could be groups that you choose actively, or just ones that you're sort of placed in, like a family, right? Or just social affiliation. That's kind of like going into the groups that you choose, right? And so, an example of this that I kind of like to use in terms of like chosen group affiliation would be like if you are a fan of a sports team. Okay. When you're a fan of that team, and it's like we're talking like the diehard fans of a sports team, and there's a shared like affiliation there. You kind of feel like they're that you're a part of them, right? And you'll hear sports fans when they have a favorite team and their team loses, they say, "Well, we lost," right? Like we, like it's us, right? And that could be an example of that, where you feel that kinship not just with the team but other fans of the team. By the way, I heard somebody once say, and as I get older, I start to wonder if this is true, that being a fan, a diehard fan of a professional sports team, is like an abusive relationship that you just keep going back to every year, right? Because if you think about it, you're going to lose. Most years you don't win the championship, right? So it usually ends in disappointment. So I don't know if that's true or not as I get older. But I've heard that said before. But anyway, so social affiliation could be something like that, or just like you have a favorite music group, just you name it, right? Just something where you feel a connection to. Sometimes people can feel that with a show they really like, and it's just their favorite show of all time, and they really got into it, or just whatever, that kinship and affiliation. And sometimes it's with the other people, sometimes it's just with other fans, right? But like, just to give you an example of a more innocent sort of group belonging that you can start to develop shared beliefs and practices and that kind of stuff. And so culture kind of like can encompass all these things. By the way, before I get off this, the organizational communication thing, where I said, you've heard the term company culture, right? And it sounds like kind of like a PC thing, or the buzzword thing you would see on a poster somewhere. Like you walk into the office and you're like in like a waiting room or conference room, and you know how they have the posters and they're like somebody's climbing the mountain and they're like achieve, dream big, something like that, right? And you'll see the one that says our values, and it's like organizational culture is important, right? We have a culture of positivity and all this stuff, right? Uh, it actually does matter. There's real research on why it matters. Like companies that have good cultures, usually people want to stay there. They're happier and they just produce better. So they produce better results, which is better for the company, which makes them more profitable, right? Because the results are better. And not just like they tend to produce better performance at work when they're happy where they like the environment that they're in, the culture there, whatever that tone is set. Not only do they produce better results, which is just leads to more profitability, they tend to interact better with customers, that kind of stuff. So it actually does matter. It really is an important thing. And again, you can sometimes take full classes on that. Another reason why that kind of matters, and this is kind of like, hey, pro tip for you, man. So when you start looking at jobs that are kind of like career jobs or like jobs that you really want to grow in, it's like it's not just like I'm taking a job because I need a job kind of thing. That's really this is the field you want to be in. You're really trying to lay your roots. Culture is really important for this reason. Now think about this: when you go out there and you get one of those jobs, or even right now, we're trying to choose a major where you want to go take your life career wise. Keep this in mind. There are three things to me that a job can offer you. Okay. And here's what they are. So the first one is just compensation. What do they give me? How much money am I getting? Right? Or benefits or things like that, right? What's the tangible things you give me? Could be money, could be benefits, all that sort of stuff. The second thing, do I like it? Is it actually what I should say? The second thing is it rewarding? And what I mean by that is you either like it, it's awesome, or you're curing cancer and you feel good about that, you're saving the kids, right? So it has some sort of altruistic benefit. You're helping the world so you feel good about you. Or again, it's just awesome. You're not necessarily, it's like you're a tattoo artist and hey, you're artistic, you like doing this, you're not curing cancer, but you think it's badass, right? And the people seem to like the tattoos you do. So you're happy doing it, right? So it's something like that. So basically it's rewarding in some way. Here's the third thing. You like the culture, you like the environment. I like the people I work with, my boss, I like them, or at least they treat me well. I'm not saying you have to be best friends with everybody at work, but you like going there, right? You don't dread it, whether it's the people you work with or like in terms of fellow employees, coworkers, or the people you have to serve, like the customers, right? And here's why I bring all this up is because now look, typically people will stay in a job if they get one. So for example, we all know this. You may be very experienced this. You're certainly as you go through life, you're going to get those people who like they're in a job and they stay because it pays the bills, right? They don't necessarily love it. It's not necessarily rewarding. And the people I work with, I could take them or leave them. It's okay. But hey, it pays the bills, so I stay. Or there's people who are in jobs that's like really rewarding. I really enjoy this. It's really not paying what I need it to pay, but I just stay because it's so much fun or it's so rewarding, right? And then there's the people that are in the jobs where the money's okay, the work itself is okay, but man, I really have fun at work. I really like the people I'm around, right? So here's what I'm talking about all this. Culture matters because it's one of the three things, if you think about it, a job can really offer you. But here's another reason to keep it in mind, which is, you know what the dream job is? You know what the best job you can get in life? The job that has all three. So don't forget about culture. Because if you have all three, you'll never leave that job. You'll love it forever. Just think about it. That's the job that pays you what you want. It's the job that you think is awesome, super fun, or you're really doing something good for the world. And I love the people I work with, right? That's the dream job. So ask yourself, what kind of job would give me that, hopefully? And second of all, when you go out there, try to find it. That's the job you want to find. That's the dream job. And so, hey, keep culture in mind. That's that third thing. That can really matter to you someday. I mean, I've certainly been in jobs like that where, man, you find that kind of job, it's tough to leave. You don't want to leave, right? Because it's so great. So look for that when you go out there. So just a little side note about company culture and why it matters. So culture really, again, just think of it as any group, shared beliefs, shared norms. But this is kind of like an example of some of the groups it can be. Okay, cultural dynamics. So these are basically, so we know what a culture is. It's a group with shared sort of beliefs, values, ways of viewing the world, and then similar practices. And it's kind of any group people come along to can be shared by like almost everybody when we talk about or I shouldn't say almost everybody. It could be shared by a large group of people when we're talking about like ethnicity or race or nationality, or it could be small, like your family dynamic, right, or something like that. So, what are those common practices or beliefs? What do they focus around? We're gonna kind of look mostly at beliefs, but here's what we have going on. So first of all, there are some that are like more rooted than others, right? That are like more hardcore, right? And that's deep structure. So this is a culture's underlying assumptions about how the world works. So it's basically the things that it's like you had me at hello. I don't even question these things. They're just so enrooted, right? They're just our core principles, beliefs, and really also just like organization, like how we like sort of identify things, right? So there are things like worldviews, general perceptions about things, values that we think are important. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a second. And history, also, again, just like that shared experience, and also shared interpretation of history, too, right? Because again, a lot of this is socialized. So, in other words, you're born, you grow up, and first it's your family, and then it's your friends, and it's media and social schools and the just institutions. They all tell us like, hey, let me explain life to you, right? And their groups you belong to, so they teach you the same thing. And so a lot of times it's shared history, right? And again, groups will have different versions of history, by the way, obviously. So depending on how they what happened in that event and how they want to interpret that event, a lot of different things at play. So it's all of these sorts of things that can play into it. But deep structure is like just the really enrooted things. And these tend to be influenced by social institutions because again we're taught these things, whether it's our family. They're all just like social institutions, right? They can be things like family, religion plays a big role in most sort of societies traditionally. Again, it's lessening but still plays a big role. Governments obviously, and then mass media, right? Like sort of whether it's commercial or news or that kind of stuff. So, and one of the like little side notes, people say, well, you're taught this stuff, it's just socialized, right? And you may not think that that's true. There's two ways to kind of know that that's true. So first of all is just kind of use some common sense in this sense. Um, a lot of people within a group, right, which I'm calling a culture, is kind of like any group, right? They tend to have shared beliefs and shared behaviors. So if it wasn't socialized, right, if we just all came up with it on our own, why would we all have the same beliefs or behaviors? That doesn't make much sense, right? So that first of all tells you probably socialized, meaning we're probably taught it. And then another thing is just use this. There's like another little test about the power of socialization. Is ask yourself. There's kind of two ways you can know anything about the world. Okay. So the first way is something called personal experience, right? You just experience it. The second one is sometimes referred to as vicarious knowledge, meaning somebody told you, right? Or you found it out third hand, right? So here's an example. How many of you have been to the moon? I'm going to assume nobody. So how do you know it's there? This could be the Truman Show. You don't know, right? You've never been to the moon, right? Is Canada? How many of you have been to Canada? Maybe some of you. That might not be. But if you have not been to Canada, how do you know it's there? By the way, I picked that because that's a real conspiracy theory that Canada is not real. Um, not that I believe that. I'm just telling you it's a thing. Look, you don't know, and I'm not saying space isn't real. Like when Neil deGrasse Tyson comes on, he's an astrophysicist, and he tells me things about space and all this sorts of stuff. Like I believe him. I think he's credible, right? But the point is, if you actually think about it, a lot of stuff in life we do not have personal experience with. In fact, the only way we know it is because somebody told us, right? Like maps tell us, Google tells us Canada's there, and Neil deGrasse Tyson tells us that space is real, right? And we trust it, right? And I'm not saying you shouldn't. You should. Most of these are reliable sources, but it's to illustrate. If you think about that exercise of what do you actually have personal experience with it with, most of us don't have personal experience with like hardly anything, right? So that shows you the power of socialization. I guess is why I'm using this example to maybe too long a story that should have been shorter, but that right there tells you how strong socialization is. So just ask yourself, what do I actually have personal experience with versus what I know about life in the world, right? And there's a pretty huge gap, right? So that tells you how powerful socialization is. And by the way, that's why I actually personally think when people make that argument, whenever like you have an opinion on something and then people go, well, you don't have experience with that, so your opinion doesn't matter, or you're not in my shoes, so your opinion doesn't matter. I just feel like that's a total cop out. That's total bull. Um, why do I feel that way? Because again, if we're going to use that logic, again, most of us don't have personal experience with like hardly anything. Like if we're going to use that logic, like most of us like could never vote, literally, because you're voting on things you do not have experience with, right? So I just think that's kind of a BS thing, right? Your opinion could still be valid. But anyway, that just kind of shows you the power of socialization. Worldview. So again, these are deep structure type things that are usually like really rooted in a culture. So an example would be worldview. So how you view the world. So it's the way a person interprets reality, such as images of themselves and how they relate to the world around them. So it's like how you view yourself, your place in the world, how you feel like you should relate to the world, right? And a lot of this tends to be based on culture. So again, the groups you belong to, and usually worldview is shaped a lot by these larger dominant cultures. So things like ethnicity, nationality, that race sometimes, right? That's where these bigger groups we belong to, not like I'm a fan of a team or I work at a certain company or this is what's going on in my family, right? These bigger ones tend to really have the big worldview kind of like influences on us. So we'll go through some examples of this in a second, but like just to give you an initial example, it'd be like, so we're using American culture as an example. It's the notion of capitalism is a good thing, right? Democracy, representative democracy, is a good thing. You shouldn't steal. I'm not saying any of those things are bad, but we're taught that. Like we're social. In fact, we're socialized to that worldview that we almost don't even question it. Like if you think about it, a fifth grader or a high schooler doesn't come home from school and one of their friends, how was history class? Or their parent says that, and the kid says, "Yeah, it's okay, but I don't know about this capitalism thing. I mean, maybe we should try something else, right? I don't know about democracy." Like very few fifth graders are saying that, or high school sophomores, right? We don't question it. We're just like, sure, right? And again, not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying like that's an example of how worldview gets ingrained, right? Depending on because there's obviously some cultures where democracy is not ingrained, or capitalism is not ingrained, right? Or you name the worldview, right? So that's basically what worldview is. So we're going to do this common differences in worldview, by the way, amongst like ethnicities, because again, usually worldview is a big culture thing, a dominant culture thing. So it's usually nationality, race, ethnicity, religious affiliation tend to like really impose these on us. So they're big groups, right? Usually, here's the common differences. So there's usually power distances, meaning should everybody feel like they have equal power and can rise to power, or is there a clear like hierarchy set? So an example of that would be like some cultures that have like monarchs or like royal families versus those that don't, or cultures that are more democratic versus not, right? So there's power distances. Usually in individualism versus collectivism, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lecture, talking about like what do you focus on? Do you focus on you, or are you taught to focus on the group as a whole? Roles of what's masculine and feminine, and sort of like what we value in society and those dynamics. Sometimes they orient to time differently, which kind of deals with like focusing on the future or the present or the past. Uncertainty avoidance. So basically this notion of like how much risk they're willing to take, right? Or do they like to keep things kind of orderly? And then indulgence versus restraint. Are you taught to sort of like live free or die, or that there's a value in sort of like in restraining yourself, essentially. So these are the common differences that we'll kind of come back to throughout the class, not just today. But this is where you see differences in worldviews, right? So, like, again, I gave you the example of the culture thing in terms of power. Like, let's take masculine versus feminine. So if you just take how we view um, uh, how we do like basically the roles of men and women in society, right? So there are cultures that essentially try to socialize equality between uh, men and women that way, right? But like, so an American culture would be an example of that, where we certainly at least talk the walk of, we believe in equality based on gender, right? Now, I say talk the walk because you could debate if that's true in terms of our behavior. Women are paid less than men for equal experience, same resume, same job, right? Including jobs that bring in the same amount of money. So, in other words, like you take my field, you could have two attorneys, one's a man, one's a woman, same experience, same educational background, and the man will typically get paid more, right? So certainly you can make, and obviously there's other examples of that with politics, and like you can certainly make the argument that like American culture says we believe in equality amongst genders, but we don't actually, when it comes to walking the walk, actually do it. But certainly we try to socialize equality, right? Now, but there's other cultures that don't really do that, right? There's certainly other cultures where they are very masculine focused, right? And that is actually ingrained in those cultures, right? We can certainly think there's some Middle Eastern cultures like that. There's some Southern American cultural dynamics that certainly are at play like that, where there is definitely a sense of masculinity and men being placed at a higher level within the culture in terms of being valued and power status. So you'll see these types of differences, right? In terms of how people are socialized to behave and believe. Individuals versus collectivists, we're going to talk again more about that a little bit later. So these are some of the common differences in worldview. So we're going to do this lecture in parts. So that's going to include part 1 of this series, and I will see you in part 2.